Okay, hello, everybody. It is January 20th, 2025. It's the day of inauguration in Washington. Um, it's very cold, and most of the people I know are, let's just say, waiting in suspense. We really the new president today has said that he will sign hundreds, quote, hundreds of executive orders. We really don't know the meaning of all of that. We'll just wait and see. The people who have opinions about what's happening, mainly they just say, take a deep breath. You heard that last week. Um, so let's just proceed. And today, or let me go backwards or in reverse order. Next week, if we can get a minimum number of people on the call, today we have 9. Marvin Kalb, who's now in his mid-90s. Okay, more people in the waiting room. Marvin Kalb was the CBS correspondent, one of the major TV networks in the United States, in Moscow during some of the most challenging times of the Cold War. And he has a wonderful story about in the middle of the Cuban Missile Crisis, he had a chance meeting backstage after an opera with Nikita Khrushchev, and got an amazing statement from Khrushchev. I mean, this is a man who's been a major media personality in the United States for many decades, and he was fluent in Russian and covered the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Let me make sure that we are all muted. Okay, so today we're going to talk about George F. Kennan. As you see, he lived a very long life, 101 years. Now, when I was a child, and we're going to talk about grand strategy. In the fall, we talked about tactics, strategy. We didn't really talk about grand strategy, and we didn't really define it, but today we try to define it by referring to George F. Kennan. He was not the only person in that period, in the 1940s, 50s, and on, to think far into the future. That's basically how we defined grand strategy, to think far into the future. Now, and of course, I think you know, Kennan is associated, he created the notion of containment in the early and most nasty, some of the most nasty periods of the Cold War. When I was a child, they told us that Khrushchev, the premier, the party leader in Moscow, said, "We will bury you." And I remember being, my reaction to that when I was told that in school was fear. I thought, oh, he's going to kill us. It turns out that may not be what he meant. I don't know exactly the words he used, but there's a Russian proverb about, I will dance on your grave, something like that, meaning we are in competition, we are in a contest, and we will see, like Shakespeare said, he who laughs last laughs best. In other words, we will see who wins this contest. Now, on the basis of this threatening sounding phrase, "we will bury you," I remember as a child being told, he may come and kill us, and I was of the generation where we hid under our desks in school in case there should be a bomb attack and so forth. There was a lot of, sometimes we call it Red Scare. We don't really know, looking back, how much of a threat the Soviet Union was to us, but we certainly knew, and now we know more in retrospect, the Soviet Union did intend to take more countries. What was then the Warsaw Pact? They wanted to add Turkey, they wanted to add Greece, Italy, and so forth, and expand their vision of the world. And the US people and the US government were opposed to this. Now, we know of Kennan as the author of the so-called Long Telegram. We'll talk about that a bit later. which is, I think, probably the most famous telegram in U.S. diplomatic history. And it was echoed in a piece that he published in Foreign Affairs magazine, Long Telegram, 1946. The so-called X article, 1947, in Foreign Affairs magazine, which he titled "The Sources of Soviet Conduct." Now, Kennan loved Russian culture. He loved normal Russians that you would see in the street, and he hated Stalin, and he hated the regime that was in place in the Soviet Union at the time. So Kennan was a person of conflicted inner thoughts, and a person who thought long and wide, and that's why we associate him with grand strategy. Now, I must admit, I always knew the name Kennan, but I didn't know much about him until this book came along in 2011. Pardon me while I admit people, by John Lewis Gaddis. Now, Gaddis created a program at Yale called Strategy. And this is, he's basically, I would say, there's one American and one Briton. You've met Sir Lawrence Friedman from King's College, now retired from King's College in London, who's kind of the world expert on strategy and the things that the precedents, the antecedents to strategy, Sun Tzu, Clausewitz, and so forth. Gaddis, I would say, is probably the American equivalent. I don't know if these two consider that they compete, but Gaddis is our American expert on strategy. Now, he convinced Kennan in 1982 to allow him, Gaddis, to do the biography on Kennan. Kennan was a very neurotic guy. We're going to talk about that later. Not an easy person. And Kennan said to Gaddis, okay, you're the guy. I will give you access to my papers, my journals, my diaries. The condition is you have to wait until after my death in order to publish, which is kind of a joke because Kennan lived to be 101 years old. And Gaddis, when I met him on February 14th, 2012, after the publication of his book, he said, you know, Johnson and Boswell, if you're familiar with the great biography, Boswell, who wrote a biography of Johnson and who shadowed him, and this is the 18th century in England. And Gaddis said, not to me personally, in a gathering, he said, I have worked on Kennan longer than Boswell worked on Johnson. Gaddis does have a sense of humor. Now, when he published his book, finally, Kennan lived to 2005. And so Gaddis had been working, gathering information, but he had to spend another 5-6 years in order to get that book out. Now, very meaningfully, he called it An American Life, because Kennan was known to have real doubts about American culture, American society. Kennan had a certain affinity, a certain personal ease and comfort with Russian culture and Russian people, though he did hate the regime. So Gaddis, as a kind of a provocation, he called it An American Life, which would have been the last choice of titles of another biographer. Now, to get into Kennan's life, we have to note that he had an older relative. He never met George Kennan, who traveled through Siberia in the late 19th century. Here's George Kennan, the older relative, who declined actually to meet his younger relative, Kennan. Kennan was easily offended, easily hurt by things and by people. And he always wanted to meet this relative, but he never did, George Kennan. Kennan wrote Siberia and the Exile System in 1891 and said the exile system, this is under the Tsarist Russia, obviously, is worse than I believe it to be, and worse than I have described. So just to put in context, why do we always say George F. Kennan, named after his middle name Frost, maybe named after Robert Frost, I'm not sure. And to distinguish between the other Kennan. Now, the Kennan Institute in Washington, where I met Gaddis, I believe is named after the older relative. Okay, now, again, as a prelude to getting into Kennan himself, Gaddis, we need to know about the biographer, the person who probably knew Kennan better than anybody. And we need to know that the biographer, Gaddis, wrote 6, 7, 8 books on strategy and was very much a follower of Isaiah Berlin. If you're not familiar, Isaiah Berlin, a Russian who ended up in the United Kingdom and taught at Oxford. He was a British intelligence agent during World War II in Washington. And Isaiah Berlin, referring to an ancient Greek folktale about the hedgehog and the fox. I think many of you are familiar with this, but you need to know this in order to fully understand Gaddis, and through Gaddis to understand Kennan. The hedgehog and the fox, and in the Greek folktale, the hedgehog, what is the source of knowledge? The hedgehog digs deep into the ground and has a depth of knowledge. The hedgehog knows, the quote is, the hedgehog knows only one thing. The fox, who scours the surface, who does not go deep into anything, but is more of a horizontal gatherer of knowledge, is the opposite of the hedgehog. And Gaddis has written extensively about what is a hedgehog. Well, hedgehogs are micromanagers, single goal oriented, single minded, and he as examples he gives the emperor of Persia when Persia invaded the Greek, what is now called Greece, Sparta, Athens, that area. Philip II of Spain, who was steadfast in wanting to maintain Catholicism in every part of Europe that he controlled, including the Netherlands, where there was where the Dutch rose up in successful rebellion against Philip II. Philip II just kept sending troops like Hitler during World War II. Never mind setbacks, never mind defeat, just keep going, keep going. And Napoleon, of course, who was obsessed with this idea of whatever it was, la gloire. Napoleon started out, I guess, with some notion of human freedom and individual liberty. He certainly betrayed that notion, and he just kept going, kept going. And at the bottom, if you can see on my screen, de Gaulle, maybe you could say de Gaulle was obstinate and very much obsessed, we could almost say, and certainly Stalin, who was easily convinced that he had enemies. And here, my screen, there we go. Okay, and then an example of foxes, and clearly Gaddis, and when he writes about this, he pretends to be even-handed. Well, there's this and there's that. There are advantages and disadvantages. I don't know if he even realizes in his own writing, clearly he prefers foxes. He prefers those who are able to see horizontally and can see the larger picture. This is what leads to grand strategy. And he gives as examples Elizabeth I, who extended the British Empire, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, perhaps Churchill, perhaps, in their comportment during the challenges of the early and mid 20th century. Now we get to Kennan as presented through the viewpoint of Gaddis. Born 1904, there are many mysterious parallels in Kennan's life. This happens to be the year that Chekhov died. Kennan, above all, loved Chekhov. He loved Chekhov. And he wasn't a very good diplomat, frankly. He didn't get along with people. He was difficult to what he really wanted. He was a man of culture, actually. And what he really wanted, his dream was to be the biographer of Chekhov. And we'll get to Chekhov at the end of this presentation. Born in Milwaukee, like in the area where F. Scott Fitzgerald came from, and that's something of some significance. It's Fitzgerald who said, the ability to conduct a meaningful operation means that you're able to contain in your mind two separate ideas at the same time. This is a recurring theme in Kennan and in his successor at the Office of Policy and Planning at the State Department, Paul Nitze, and that Nitze will be a separate presentation. These were two men, both of them from elite schools. They were both Caucasian men, and they were friendly throughout their lifetime, but they had opposite views of how to conduct business with the Soviet Union. We'll get to that. Kennan never recovered. His mother died 2 months after his birth. And Kennan, through his whole life, had a sense of guilt. He felt somehow it was his fault that his mother died of peritonitis 2 months after he was born. Now, these things happen, but it happens that in Kennan's life, this becomes a key to his neurosis, to his sense of instability, his self-doubt. And I'll race to the end of his life, which I might forget to mention later. There was I think it was a poem or a narrative, I think of Chekhov, which Kennan read. He must have been 98 years old, something like that. And he was at a public occasion, and he read this passage of a boy, maybe 10-year-old boy, walking across the Russian steppes with a group of people, not knowing where he was going, not knowing where he came from, not knowing why he was there. And at the age of 98 or so, burst into tears and could not continue the presentation he was given. Kennan lived his whole life feeling, let's just call it, he was motherless. I don't know what else to call it. He had such feelings of a doubt of himself and insecurity. Now we have to talk about this, since this was an intrinsic part of his thinking when he created containment. After his mother's death, he was basically raised by his sister, Jeanette. He was never very close with his father. When I say Presbyterian, I mean they're stereotypes of Presbyterians from the American Midwest being sort of distant, kind of aloof. In any case, the father was. And Kennan was a very lonely person. Actually, throughout his whole life, he was, when he went to college, he didn't feel he was really part of the social group. He was from the Midwest, which was already at that time something not very distinguished. When he worked as a diplomat, he was a terrible diplomat, and some people recognize his brilliance, but he kept making mistakes as a diplomat. So we'll get into that a little bit later. Who did he read? Well, and this is important. He read Edward Gibbon. Now, we're talking late 18th century. It may seem irrelevant, but the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. Kennan was very affected by this book and the phrase "chastise the contumacy," meaning, according to Gibbon, the cause of the fall of the Roman Empire was, we've talked about this before, overextension. The Roman Empire tried to go too far in too many conquered lands with too many designs of how it wanted to organize the world. And Kennan later made a direct comparison of the Roman Empire with the Soviet Union, which was doing the same in the mid-20th century. His other book that he referred to, and he did refer to it in his articles, actually, Buddenbrooks. Thomas Mann, the novel about a very eminent family, which had the seeds of its own destruction within. And we know that Kennan read Buddenbrooks around 1920 or so, just before he began his career, and was, again, refers to Buddenbrooks in his articles, which was one reason why the Mr. X article, which was supposed to be anonymous, it took seconds. It was a very short time before observers understood this had to be Kennan, because it's people knew that he was very influenced by Gibbons and by Thomas Mann. So the idea of an entity, in this case, an aristocrat or a mercantilely successful family, having the roots of its own destruction. This became part of his grand strategy thinking when he believed that the Soviet Union would eventually collapse. He was quite right. He had no idea it would take 70, 75 years, but he foresaw, he was a sage, he was kind of a prophet in drawing from these two books, the idea that the Soviet Union, just never mind, don't confront, don't permit them. Containment was a strange idea. It was neither belligerent nor pacifistic, something in between. But then just have confidence. This thing is going to collapse, which it did in 1989, 1991. Now, Kennan's early postings, he was taken right out of college. In those days, in the 1920s, we have the expression pale male in Yale. The Foreign Service was almost 100% Caucasian men from elite universities, and Kennan was one of those. Now, he, I suddenly remember that Linda Thomas Greenfield, the opposite of pale male in Yale, who has been our permanent representative to the United Nations and was the head of the Africa Bureau in the State Department, just posted a few days ago her farewell message, where she talks about 40 years ago when she took the oath to become a Foreign Service officer. She felt she was surrounded, even then, 40 years ago, by pale male and Yale. Linda Thomas Greenfield is the most benign, benevolent person I've ever met. She embraces all people of all backgrounds, including pale male and Yale. And her farewell text is quite moving. Maybe I'll post it on Blackboard. She's the opposite. The Foreign Service has changed hugely since the 1920s. Now, in the late 20s, the people who, the upper echelons of the State Department, recognized Kennan as a person of talent and intellect. And they said, what language do you want to learn? He said, well, I don't know. German and Russian. So he was sent to Switzerland first to be a consular officer, then to Hamburg, where his job was to learn German and Russian. And this was the origin. I mean, imagine having a career where your boss says, you have 3 years, just learn a language. Can you imagine? And he had this marvelous advantage. He did learn very fluent German and Russian. He was sent to Riga in 1931 before the United States, had diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union. The aftermath of World War II, it was almost immediately clear that our ally, the Soviet Union, was going to become a competitor, a rival, and an enemy, let's just say. So we had a listening post, so-called, in Riga, Latvia, where Kennan was sent to be a third secretary. Now, Riga was all we had. We didn't have an embassy in Moscow in 1931. But when we did, 2 years later, Kennan was invited by Ambassador William C. Bullitt to come and work in Moscow, which was Kennan's dream. He was fascinated. He loved the Russian people. He hated the Soviet government. He loved Chekhov. This was a great dream of his, to become immersed in the Russian world. He worked there with Americans are familiar with the names Charles Bolin, Chip Bolin, we called him, Loy Henderson. These were major figures in the State Department at that time. Now, after Bullitt came Ambassador Joseph Davies during the Stalin purges. And the purges were disgusting. And Kennan fully understood this is not acceptable. His boss, Joseph Davies, thought, well, a purge, he wasn't very impressed. And so Kennan, from this very early stage, became an outlier. He very much disagreed with his boss, couldn't get along with him. And they had a very bad working relationship. Again, as I've said, vast sympathies for the Russian people. I don't know how to get rid of this toolbar, but we'll live with it. Certainly not with the Soviet states. Now, in 1938, we're getting close to World War II. This is pretty interesting. He's sent from Moscow to Prague, where he learns, I think he learned Czech pretty well. And almost immediately, the Nazis came for the Sudetenland and did not stop. And then the Czech, what was then Czechoslovakia, was basically under the, let's say, the influence of the Nazi regime. Now, from there, Kennan was assigned, can you imagine, to Berlin, of all places, on the eve of World War II. Kennan was in favor of what we call Lend-Lease, which was Roosevelt's gesture to European countries, including the Soviet Union, by the way, made an offer to the Soviet Union and France and England. We will help you. We will give you materiel. We will give you commercial benefits. Roosevelt was not ready at all. He ran on the platform of, like Wilson, of not going to war, but later had to turn around on that. Kennan was in favor of Lend-Lease, even in the Soviet Union, but he was not in favor of any other type of recognition for the Soviet Union. 1941, after Pearl Harbor, Germany, you may remember, it was Germany that declared war first, before the US did. And at which point, Kennan was a prisoner of the Nazi regime during 6 months. And obviously, he wasn't in a concentration camp. He was fed, he was treated. It was like a normal prison, but he became, this was his experience of Nazi Germany, was as being interned when diplomats and high officials from the West, the Nazi regime wasn't quite sure what to do with them, so they just kept him confined. And Kennan spent 6 months in those conditions. It was not good. It was not life-threatening. Still during World War II, when he was released from internment, he went as charge d'affaires. A charge d'affaires is like an ambassador, only it's a person who has not presented letters of credential to the head of state, but rather is in a sort of a secondary status. And he was sent to Lisbon during the war, and his success was he sat down physically with Franklin Delano Roosevelt and convinced Roosevelt to negotiate with the Portuguese dictator Salazar in exchange, and to convince Salazar during World War II that the US should have a naval base in the Azores, which was a Portuguese possession. So this was an early success of Kennan, and Kennan did this directly with the President of the United States. Now, he was obviously obsessed with the Soviet Union. He wanted to go back. He wanted to do something. He went, I think, 3 times, maybe 4, back to the Soviet Union. He wanted to use his knowledge. He was taken just before the end of World War II as the deputy chief of mission under Averell Harriman, when Harriman was ambassador to the Soviet Union. And during that period, or let's just say after the end of the war, April 1945 in Europe, August in Japan, 1946, the year I was born, by the way, the Washington, the State Department asked the embassy in Moscow, what in the world is going on? How can you explain what Stalin is doing? What's happening? And Averell Harriman, who really trusted his subordinate Kennan, said, okay, you write it. And Kennan wrote the so-called long telegram in 1946 in response to a request from Washington. It was almost 5,000 words, one of the longest diplomatic documents ever drafted. And I'll give you some quotes from that very famous cable, which in 5,000 words, I've read the whole thing. I think the word containment, it comes once or twice. It's sort of I don't think Kennan ever really meant for it to be, he never meant for that term to be associated with him. But this was the term that people picked up from this very wonderfully descriptive cultural, intellectual cable, which I will quote from in a moment. After 1946, he went back to DC and he was on the Soviet desk. So he was really, his whole career really was Soviet Union. Now, during the war, Roosevelt, the famous Balkan proverb, in time of great danger, I may walk to the devil until I've crossed the bridge. This was Roosevelt's justification for embracing this disgusting individual, Stalin. I mean, not physically, but he realized the only hope of winning World War II was in alliance with the Soviet Union. And in fact, that was true. Without the Eastern Front, we don't know what the outcome of World War II would have been. So Roosevelt probably was thinking pretty clearly when he cited this Balkan proverb. At the same time, Kennan, who I keep repeating this, hated Stalin, hated the Soviet regime. He said there was some mysterious affinity which I could not explain even to myself. Again, this was a cultural thing, a sociological thing. It wasn't political. He imagined, he had kind of a nostalgia of what Russia might have been before the Bolsheviks arrived, when his senior relative, the other Kennan, was going across Siberia, looking at the horrible conditions of the Tsarist prisons in Siberia. But Kennan, because he loved Chekhov and he loved the literature, he said he had this mysterious affinity. Later in 1952, when he visited Yasnaya Polyana, which was Chekhov's estate, modest estate, he, again, here we go. There we go. He said, I feel close to a world which I always thought I could really have belonged to, when he visited Yasnaya Polyana. He loved that visit. And by the way, at about the same time, a little bit earlier, purchased a farm in Pennsylvania in a town called East Berlin. Now, how ironic is that? We'll get to that very, very important aspect of his life, gardening. And he saw diplomacy, successful diplomacy, as an exercise in planting seeds, being patient. This is grand strategy. Plant the seeds, don't pay too much attention, and have faith that the seeds will sprout. He did this in his farm in East Berlin, Pennsylvania. And when he visited Yasnaya Polyana, he understood Chekhov as a gardener. And it may seem very different the world of diplomacy and the world of theater and literature. But Kennan was imbued with this similarity. The Long Telegram, 1946, more than 5,000 words. There's just a few quotes here, obviously 5,000 words, but some that stand out. Stalin needs an enemy, needs an enemy. Now this, you can think of many parallels to this. Maybe you could say Ronald Reagan needed an enemy. The Argentine officials in the terrible years of the 1970s needed an enemy. This is characteristic of regimes that strengthen themselves by convincing their people. Certainly Putin today absolutely needs an enemy. These are quotes from the Long Telegram. Stalin uses Marxism-Leninism as a justification for the Soviet Union's instinctive fear of the outside world. Now, this is, Kennan really nailed it here, because the Putin, who is a vicious, aggressive abuser of human rights, I talked during the fall about fear as a motivator in any crisis, any conflict. And it does seem, I'm not an expert on Russian history, but it seems that fear of the Mongols from the east, fear of the Nazis and the Napoleon from the west, fear that the next invasion was always coming. This may have been a genuine fear, not a fabricated one. But he said Stalin uses Marxism-Leninism as a fig leaf of their moral and intellectual respectability. This is enormous disdain and frankly hatred of Stalin, who, I mean, to say Soviet Union, Stalin at that time embodied the government. He was not just a passing phenomenon. He was the embodiment of the regime. And he said very, very briefly, again, I don't think I've seen the word containment more than once, maybe twice in that cable of 5,000 words. The USSR should be contained by the adroit and vigilant application of a counterforce at a series of constantly shifting geographical and political points. Now, this was a pretty complicated sentence, and my point is going to be, it was interpreted very differently by different people. President Truman, who succeeded Roosevelt after Roosevelt died, took this notion of containment and turned it into the Truman Doctrine, which was a rather aggressive militaristic doctrine, which said publicly, Soviet Union, do not go to Greece or Turkey. We will confront you. Kennan was appalled. He was dismayed when his notion of containment turned into something called the Truman Doctrine. Truman hated Kennan, and the hate was returned because Kennan was in the middle. He was nuanced. This is why he was a bad diplomat. He wasn't quite clear about what he was saying. In fact, later in Kennan's life, we know, was he a hawk or a dove? He was a dove. He was really, he never said it. He never said it out, but he wanted the US government to do everything possible to avoid another conflict. That was his driving force. Truman was the opposite. Truman took this notion of containment and used it to create the Truman Doctrine. Now, later, George Marshall, Secretary of State after World War II, recommended to Truman that Kennan be the head of a new office. S in this S/P, S is secretary, and P stands for policy and planning. Now, this office was created for Kennan in 1947 and still exists. At the time, it was sort of a little think tank within the State Department where the great brains were supposed to gather and advise the Secretary of State, who would advise the National Security Council, who would advise the president. But to everybody, nobody could get along with Kennan, but everybody recognized he was a superior intellect. And Truman said, yes, okay, create this SP, this Office of Policy and Planning, and let Kennan be the head of it. Again, there was no personal friendship between Truman and Kennan. Kennan took on Paul Nitze, the subject of another presentation I'd like to give you at some point. Kennan and Nitze worked very closely together. They were very friendly. They had opposite views about what should be done. Interestingly, Kennan, when he left in 1950, recommended that Nitze follow him, even knowing that they disagreed very greatly about their view of what to do about the world. Foreign Affairs is the periodical magazine published by the Council on Foreign Relations. It's the premier publication to this day from the 1920s until the present. This is the go-to place. Circulation today, 300,000. He published in 1947 under the pen name Mr. X. This didn't fool anybody. Everybody knew Mr. X was George Kennan because it was very clear, especially in his references to Gibbons and to Thomas Mann. I mean, it had to be Kennan. Everybody knew this. He didn't really mean for it to be anonymous, but it was basically the public version of the long telegram. It was the same content. In his published article, which had been republished and republished many times, basic document, it's clear that the main element of any United States policy toward the Soviet Union must be that of long-term, patient, but firm and vigilant containment of Russian expansive tendencies. This is grand strategy. And it is, it's the gardener. Plant the seeds. Don't be too worried about how they will grow. Have faith that they will flourish. And there are other quotes here. I didn't want to slow this down too much, but the so-called X article, their own intransigence to the outside world began to find its own reaction. Soon they were forced to use another Gibbonesque phrase. I mean, this identified the author as Kennan for sure, to chastise the contumacy. Again, Kennan used this term. It's not a current expression in the English language, but in the 18th century, it meant to punish the bad behavior, punish the bad behavior. Two more people, excuse me while I admit them. Okay. Okay. That's the X article. And then the X article also quotes Buddenbrooks. He, Thomas Mann, compared the Buddenbrook family in the days of its greatest glamour to one of those stars, misprint, stars whose light shines, another misprint, sorry, most brightly in this world, when in reality, it has long since ceased to exist. Again, this was his vision of the inevitable decline of the Soviet Union. And he concludes in the X article, to avoid destruction, the United States need only measure up to its own best traditions and prove itself worthy of preservation as a great nation. Kennan was very conflicted about America. He thought it had become vulgar and simplified and kind of stupid. He was nostalgic about the America that he imagined of the 19th century, which he never really knew, but where he imagined Americans being resilient and innovative and able to take care of themselves. He saw the 20th century as a decline in American culture. And yet, he also held a firm belief that it was a great nation. Again, he was a man of contrasts and inner conflicts. So I think this phrase may be why Gaddis chose the title of his book, An American Life, because while Kennan is perceived by many, including Kennan himself, as being kind of ambivalent about America. He was American, and he did value the abstraction of American culture as he saw it as its best. Now, containment turned into the Truman Doctrine in 1947. Truman, I was surprised to learn this last week, that we're nagging NATO countries to spend 2% of their GNP. After World War II, the United States was spending 5% of GNP on defense, and under the Truman Doctrine, the amount tripled, became 15%. Kennan was furious. Kennan said, "This is not at all what I meant when I talked about containment." And again, the Truman-Kennan relationship was a very bad one. And then when we see later, if I get a chance to tell you about Paul Nitze, Kennan's close colleague who saw everything the opposite, we'll see more about how this Truman Doctrine developed. I think we'll skip this part. Walter Lippmann was a publicist. He was a communicator. Before the term public diplomacy existed, Lippmann was kind of the embodiment of public diplomacy. He worked for President Wilson. He was a kind of a propagandist, but he was also a person who was very loyal to the truth. And he openly criticized Kennan. As soon as everybody figured out in 1947, this Mr. X article, well, that's Kennan, I mean, no brainer. Lippmann immediately went after him, and he said, "The policy is misconceived, and must result in a misuse of American power." Lippmann understood Kennan in the way that Truman misunderstood Kennan. He thought what Kennan was saying was, go and fight them. America first. Never mind the Atlantic community and the United Nations, just go it alone, which was the opposite of what Kennan meant to say. But in his long telegram and in his Mr. X article, he was ambiguous enough to be misunderstood by superior intellects like Lippmann, who also said it would take us to the destruction of the UN. And then Kennan was very dismayed. He had high regard for Lippmann, and he said, "Well, no, that's not what I meant. I was meaning that when there's Soviet hostility anywhere in the world, we should do everything possible to contain it and not let them expand it." I didn't, going to the bottom of this quote, I didn't think I needed to explain that the Soviet Union is not going to attack the United States. That's ridiculous. They will expand in Europe and in Asia, but they're not going to. It's not part of their mentality to attack another continent. He said, "I thought that would be obvious, but I should have explained it." He did explain it decades later in 1996. Okay, now Kennan, as I've said, was a very conflicted person. He made some pretty ugly statements about American culture. "I hate democracy." This was in a letter to his sister, Jeanette. "I hate the people, and I have become clearly un-American." Not so. I mean, he was always American. He always believed in the greatness and the power of the United States. He had his doubts. He believed that the commercialism and the ease of life had made America a weak culture, not a weak country, and not a country without value. But he saw a conflict in himself of how, and he has this very funny comparison: democracy. He didn't really care much for democracy. He was an elitist, let's just say it. All people that we pay attention to have defects, have pros and cons. Everybody does. We can say, he should have believed more in democracy. Well, this was what he said. He saw democracy as a dinosaur, a huge body and a tiny brain. He lives in his comfortable primeval mud, pays little attention to his environment, slow to wrath, which is obviously a reference to the United States, very slow in formulating a policy when there's a major challenge like World War I, World War II. He just lies there, this dinosaur. He's just happy in his mud until you whack his tail off and make him aware that his interests are being disturbed. At this point, he grasps it. He lays about him with such blind determination that he not only destroys his adversary, but largely wrecks his own native habitat. So this was a very funny metaphor that Kennan used to describe democracy. Kennan was not a healthy person. He had these ailments that you have on the screen. He had an ego. He was anti-Semite. He was a racist. He didn't really like American culture. He was, and I put paranoia in quotes here because I don't think we should be using this word if we don't really mean it in a psychiatric sense. But he did, when he was in Moscow, he always had suicide pills nearby. His Norwegian wife was, at times, he became bored with her and he looked for other sources of spiritual and physical comfort in Moscow. He knew he was doing this. He knew if he were caught, he would have to take the suicide pills. Now, was this paranoia? I don't know, but he was a person constantly in fear. And he had certain self-destructive tendencies. This brings us to Tempelhof, 1952, the shortest ambassadorship that I can think of. He was sent finally, in 1952, I think it was in April or May, he finally got his life dream. He became the ambassador to the Soviet Union. He went home on a visit. He made a stopover at Tempelhof Airport in Berlin in 1952. He was confronted by the media who said, "How are things in Moscow?" And his answer could not have been worse. He said, referring to his time when he was interned in a Nazi prisoner of war camp, or rather, not prisoner of war. He was a diplomat in internment camp. He said, "Oh, you asked me, how are things in Moscow? Kind of the way they were in Berlin in the 1940s. Well, Stalin heard this. He hit the roof and he withdrew. He PNG'd. We use that as a verb, persona non grata. Kennan, after 5 months in the job, was driven away by Stalin. Said, no, I don't accept this. You are persona non grata. Goodbye." And that was the end of Kennan in the Soviet Union, and basically the end of his career. Now, I've been talking mainly through the biographer Gaddis. A second biography came out in 2023 by Frank Castigliola, who teaches at a public university in Connecticut. It's not Yale, it's like the University of Connecticut, I think. And Castigliola, who was not chosen by Kennan, but who did have access to the Kennan diaries, published a book on the Kennan diaries. And later, he respected Gaddis. These people are both alive and they both live in Connecticut. And they look at each other. Castigliola was a little bit critical of Gaddis. And so he published a book, another biography, 12 years later, on Kennan, called A Life Between Two Worlds in 2023. And Castigliola gave his biography was less political and less diplomatic and more personal. And he went into the demons inside Kennan, the psychological problems that he had. Kennan was very early, was obsessed with Freud and with these dualities, civilization against eros. He saw these as two things competing for our attention. Eros, which he certainly surrendered to when he had his affairs with women other than his wife, and he did this. He decided in a very private and inner way that he had to do this. Civilization he saw as the opposite, of Eros. Civilization was the restraint of instincts that make you do bad things. Of course, he saw Russia as opposed to the US. These are oppositions, these are contrasts. Elitism versus democracy, culture versus government. He had a nervous breakdown in 1935. This man was not well. And the Castigliola biography gives us a fascinating other look at Kennan, the person, rather not so much the long strategy, the grand strategy, which he does talk about, but more about Kennan, the person. And by the way, not related to Castigliola. After Kennan's career, later in life, he's lived for 40, 50 years after leaving the State Department. We know, again, I say this without judgment. He was opposed to the Vietnam War. He was opposed to NATO expansion. He was opposed to the arms race and to the Strategic Defense Initiative, which people called Star Wars of Reagan, which was something like the Iron Dome of Israel. It was the idea. At the time, it seemed crazy. The idea that you could believe that you could be protected by the Strategic Defense Initiative, which would shoot down missiles. Now we see that they're doing it every day in Ukraine and in Israel. But it was considered crazy, and Kennan considered it crazy. He supported Eugene McCarthy. This is not Joe McCarthy. This is Eugene McCarthy, who ran for president in 1976. I mean, I remember Eugene McCarthy. He's basically forgotten by history. He lost, of the 50 states, he lost in 49 states. He was very much on the left. He was what we in America call a liberal, what you would call a progressive in Europe and elsewhere. He came into American political life as an opponent of Vietnam War, which Kennan was. And so later in Kennan's life, we know that he was not a hawk. Now, here's just a moment. Here's a quote on something that happened to Kennan in 1958. Again, I keep coming back to Chekhov. And this is Kennan's words below. He went to see the Cherry Orchard in 1958. This stirred all the rusty, untuned strings of the past and of my own youth. Riga, Latvia, and the Russian landscape, and the staggering, unexpected familiarity and convincingness of the Chekhovian world. It stirred up my Russian self, and having all this prodded to the surface in me, I sat there blubbering, crying, weeping like a child, and trying desperately to keep the rest of the company from noticing it. He had a tremendous, deep self-doubt. He thought of himself as a very tragic character. He was never recognized by the people whose recognition he sought, not his father, not his many bosses. They respected him, but they didn't like him. And he saw Chekhov as something very much along the wavelength of his own inner psychological being. And it was Castigliola who brought this out in his 2023 biography. Now, we end our discussion of Kennan with the notion of the diplomat as a gardener. He said, we must be gardeners, not mechanics, in our approach to world affairs. Make of this what you will. Can we apply this to the challenges we face in 2025? Maybe we have no choice. Maybe we cannot fix in the sense that a mechanic can fix a broken engine. We must rather think of ourselves as gardeners, planting the seeds. Actually, without self-aggrandizement, I think of this course as kind of planting seeds. We don't know where this is going to go. We can only do our best, be very mindful about planting seeds with the faith that they will produce a garden. Again, 1942, he bought a farm. in Pennsylvania. And he went back there throughout the rest of his life. He lived till 2005. He kept going back to this farm where he grew things. And Chekhov was a gardener. And Yasnaya Polyana, his estate, he planted a garden. Chekhov, a medical doctor, knew that his life would be short. He had tuberculosis. He knew that he would not live long. He planted his garden in Melikhovo, knowing that he would never live to see the results. This is quite moving. And Chekhov, Kennan, we really need to see them together. Let me just add a little postscript here. Nicholas Burns, our outgoing ambassador to China, published in 2021 about George Shultz, who was a very wonderful Secretary of State, a Republican. He loved his people, the people who worked for him. Shultz also lived to be 101. What a coincidence. Shultz, Burns said in 2020, had a deep commitment to what he called tending the diplomatic garden. Now, I don't know if Shultz took this word for word from Kennan, but Shultz also was the embodiment in his work with Shevardnadze and Gorbachev and Reagan. Shultz was the steady hand that he was optimistic about the future. Kennan, or rather, I should say, Nitze, will be in another talk. Nitze was pessimistic. Schultz was optimistic, and he was a gardener. There are elements of truth and wisdom in both of these extremes. Human affairs are very complicated. There's never a simple answer to a challenge. And so we leave you with that. Now, when the Gaddis book came out, there were a ton of wonderful reviews in the New York Review of Books, and the New Yorker, and the New York Times, and the Economist, and everywhere. This was a major event when Gaddis's book came out. Louis Menand of the New Yorker and Kissinger both wrote reviews of this book in which they said, Kennan, he's a realist. He's a realist. The title of Menand's review was Get Real, an American colloquialism, Get Real. Kissinger, a realist, saw Kennan as his inspiration. And of course, we are left with the ambiguous notion of containment. Was he a hawk? Was he a dove? We will see, I hope we get a chance to talk about Nitze, whom Kennan chose to be his successor in the Office of Policy and Planning, and who had opposite opinions about how to deal with the world. Kennan never said so, but we know what he meant. He meant avoid conflict at all costs. Do what you can to slow down the advance of the Soviet Union. They have evil motives. Do everything you can short of conflict. Nitze was the opposite. And that's what we have for today, folks. Let's see, I see there's a chat. Oh, from Peterson. Let's see, it's a little past the hour. Let's look at Peterson's comment here, if you can see it. America after 9/11. Aha, America being prehistoric creature is not that far. Thank you, Peterson. That's a very good point. After 9/11, you're quite right. And America was complacent, and the Cold War was over, and the end of history, and all this stuff. And then boom, there was 9/11, which changed everything. And the dinosaur metaphor, you're right, Peterson. It's quite apt for what George Bush Jr. did after 9/11. The war on terrorism, the subsequent invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, made the world less safe, and much to the detriment of ending terrorism. I very much agree with you, Peterson. That's a great observation. Let's not forget how the surveillance state after 9/11 goes contrary to American values of freedom, a reaction that destroys its own habitat. Peterson, wonderful observation. And I won't take credit for this. Let Kennan take credit for this. A realist Learning about Kennan laid a great foundation to how I understand this theory, just as much as learning about Morgenthau. Thank you. Thank you, Peterson. Those are great observations. Now, folks, let me end the recording here. Do I know how to do that? Let's see.